The mountain did not care that she was a queen. It rose above the tree line in a wall of black basalt and ancient ice, indifferent to the small figure picking her way up its lower slopes in the gray hour before dawn. Kael'vora had left her wedding feast still burning behind her, the torches, the silk pavilions, the laughter of 1,000 Orc clan chiefs who had drunk deep, and would not notice her absence until the sun was high. She had left the groom too, sleeping off the mead in the pavilion of honor, one thick arm thrown over a bolster as though it were already a conquered province. She had not run. Queens did not run. She had simply walked north toward the mountains, and she had not stopped. In her right hand she carried a shard of something that was not quite a gemstone and not quite a living coal. It was the size of her fist, faceted on one side and rough on the other where it had been broken from a larger piece. Even through the leather wrapping she had bound around it, she could feel the warmth of it, steady and precise as a heartbeat. The Vethkai, the humans called it when they whispered of it at all, which was rarely and never in the open. The fire that listens. Behind her, something was following. She did not look back. She had learned this much from her mother. You do not give a predator the satisfaction of your fear. You keep your stride even. You keep your breathing slow. You make yourself into something that belongs to the landscape, something unremarkable, something the pursuing thing might decide to look past. It did not look past her. 3 days earlier, in the lowland city of Var Ashek, an agent of the conclave had stood in a room of cool stone and delivered a report in the flat, affectless voice of a man who had spent 20 years learning to feel nothing about the things he witnessed. His name was Davin Stair. He was human, which in Var Ashek made him roughly as welcome as a muddy boot at a formal dinner. The conclave, 7 Orc clan mothers and their male advisors, had brought him here because he was good at finding things, and what they needed found was this: who had stolen the Vethkai fragments from the Electro's vault 6 nights ago, and where were those fragments now? The vault break-in had been elegant. 3 operatives, one of whom had not survived the exit, had moved through the building's underground drainage system, bypassed locks that should have been unbypassable, and made off with a carrying case that held 4 fragments of the Vethkai crystal array. The crystal, if reassembled and properly calibrated, could power a weapon of extraordinary and terrible precision. A weapon that could, according to the Conclave's own researchers, disintegrate a designated target from a distance of 40 leagues. Stair had spent 3 days not sleeping and had assembled the following. The mastermind was a male orc named Rameth, who styled himself a count and made his public living designing ornamental armor for wealthy clans. Rameth had 2 lieutenants, an older orc called Dutch, who had a history of service to the conclave that had ended in disgrace, and a smaller, faster operative simply called the Spaniard, whose actual name and origin Stair had not yet been able to determine. The client, he believed, was the Keth Dominion. When he said this last part, the room went very quiet in a way that suggested everyone in it had already suspected it, and had been hoping he would say something different. The Keth Dominion was not, technically speaking, an enemy of the Orc clans. It was a power from the deep east, ancient and patient, ruled by an emperor whose lifespan no one had reliably measured. The Dominion did not fight wars. It acquired. It waited. And when the moment was right, it absorbed. The Orc clans had been watching it creep westward for 3 generations, and for 3 generations the clan mothers had concluded that the correct response was to watch a little longer. If the Dominion got the Vethkai array complete and weaponized, the watching was over. Stair's superior, a heavy-set man named Hogan who had a gift for delivering difficult news with the mild expression of someone describing weather, told him to find Rameth, recover the fragments, and eliminate the people trying to sell them. Stair asked if there were any constraints on method. Hogan considered this for a moment. "Don't start a war," he said finally, "other than that." It was the kind of instruction that sounded simple and was not. What Stair did not know, in that room of cool stone, what the conclave did not know, because the conclave had spent so long watching one horizon that it had stopped watching the others, was that the theft was only half the problem. The other half was Kael'vura. She was 23 years old and the daughter of clan mother Sorva, which made her a princess of the Ashek Reach, and by the agreement hammered out over 2 seasons of brutal negotiation, the future bride of warlord Drath of the Keth Dominion's western garrison. The marriage was a piece of statecraft so cold and precise that it made Stayer's own work look warm. Drath got a legitimate foothold in Orc clan territory through marriage alliance. The Ashek Reach got a promise that the Keth Dominion would stop its westward creep at the current border. Kael'vura got Drath. What nobody had bothered to tell Kael'vura, because nobody had thought to ask whether she might be relevant to anything beyond the symbolism of the ceremony, was that she had spent the previous 4 years quietly and methodically becoming the most knowledgeable person alive on the subject of the Vethkai array. She had started because it was interesting. She had continued because it became alarming. She had finished, or rather, reached the point where she understood enough to be genuinely frightened, 3 months before her wedding was announced, which was the kind of timing that felt later like either a terrible coincidence or a precisely orchestrated cruelty. The Vethkai fragments in the carrying case that Rameth's people had stolen from the Electro's vault were not the only pieces of the array. There was a 5th fragment. It had been in the Ashek Reach's possession for 11 years, kept in a secondary vault whose existence was known to exactly 3 people: Clan Mother Sorva, the vault keeper, and Kael'vura, who had found the inventory record 3 years ago and had spent the time since then reading everything she could about what the fragment actually was. The night before her wedding, someone had come for it. She had been awake, she had barely slept in weeks, and she had heard them moving in the lower corridor. She had taken the fragment from its vault herself, wrapped it in leather, and walked out through the servants' passage. She had not stopped to write a note. She had not stopped to wake her mother. She had not, if she was being honest with herself, stopped to think clearly about anything at all. She had simply understood, with the cold animal clarity that sometimes replaces thought in moments of genuine danger, that the fragment could not be allowed to leave Ashek Reach in the hands of whoever was currently moving through the lower corridor, and that the only way to ensure this was to move faster than they did. She had been moving ever since. The thing following her up the mountain was not an animal. She had known this since the first night, when she had made camp in a hollow beneath a fallen tree and had listened to the sounds of pursuit stop, and then resume on a schedule that felt too considered, too patient, to be anything with 4 legs. Animals followed when they were hungry and stopped when they were not, or when they lost the scent, or when something more interesting came along. This thing did not stop for any of those reasons. It stopped at intervals that she eventually recognized as shift changes. There were at least 3 of them. She thought about this as she climbed, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, the fragment warm against her palm through the leather wrapping. 3 operatives taking turns, maintaining enough distance that she might almost convince herself she was imagining it. Patient, professional, unhurried. Rameth's people then, or the Keth Dominions. At this point the distinction might not matter much. The path she was following was not a path. It was a route she had memorized from maps she had studied in her years of research, a way through the Vard Pass that few people knew was passable in early season. Above the pass, there was a research station, an old one, established by human engineers 40 years ago and since abandoned, but the records she had read suggested the infrastructure remained. More importantly, the records suggested that the station had been built around a natural resonance chamber in the rock, a geological formation that the original researchers had found useful for their experiments, and that Kael'vura had reason to believe was the only place in 100 leagues where the AI fragment could be safely contained and isolated, made, in effect, inert. If she could reach the station, she could neutralize the fragment. It would no longer be a weapon component. It would be, at best, an expensive geological curiosity. This was her plan. It was not a good plan in the sense of being simple or reliable or likely to succeed. It was a good plan in the sense that it was the only plan she had. She climbed. Davin Stayer found Dutch Holland in a rooming house on the east edge of the city, in a room that smelled of old leather and something chemical that Stayer couldn't immediately identify. Dutch was sitting at a small table, not drinking the cup of something in front of him, staring at his own hands as though they had recently done something that surprised him. He was older than Stayer had expected. The file had given him a history, service record, the disgrace, the years since, but the file couldn't give you the particular quality of exhaustion that sat in a man's face when he had been doing something he knew was wrong for long enough that he'd stopped expecting to feel differently about it. Stayer sat down across from him, without being invited. Dutch looked up. He didn't reach for a weapon, which was interesting. "You're the human," Dutch said. His voice was the voice of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that effect cost more than it was worth. Flat, careful. "I'm a human," Stayer said. "There are several of us." "The Conclave's human, the one looking for Rameth." "I'm looking for the fragments." Dutch turned his cup slowly on the table. Around and around, a small circular motion, rhythmic, almost meditative. "The fragments are going east," he said. "With Rameth. He's already moved them." "All four." The cup stopped. "There's a fifth," Stayer said. Dutch was quiet for a long moment. Outside, someone in the street below was arguing about something, voices rising and falling. A cart wheel grinding on cobblestones. The ordinary sounds of a city that did not know, or had decided not to think about, what was being decided in small rooms above its streets. "The princess took it," Dutch said, "not a question." "Apparently." "Where did she go?" "North," Stayer said, "toward the Vard Range." Dutch put both hands flat on the table. His expression had shifted to something that was not quite decision and not quite surrender but lived in the territory between them. "She's trying to reach the Cathara station," he said. "If she gets there, if she gets the fragment into the resonance chamber, the whole array is broken. The weapon doesn't work without all 5 pieces in calibration." "I know," Stayer said, "which is why I need to find her before Rameth does." Dutch looked at him for a long time. Stayer had spent his career learning to read silences, and this one was a man reassembling something inside himself, fitting old pieces back into a configuration he had abandoned and was now reconsidering. "I can get you to Rameth," Dutch said finally. "I know where he's going, but I want something." "What do you want?" "I want to be there when it ends," Dutch said. "I want to be useful for something at the finish, that's all." It was an odd thing to ask for. Stayer turned it over in his mind, looking for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden leverage. He didn't find any. Sometimes a man just wanted to be on the right side of a thing before it was over, and there was no deeper logic than that. "All right," Stayer said. The storm came in on the second day of climbing, which Kael'vora had known it would because she had been watching the cloud formations since she left the city, and she had read enough meteorology to recognize when the mountains were deciding to be inhospitable. She had packed for it. She had a length of treated canvas that could serve as a windbreak, enough dried food for 5 days, and a small heating element that ran on a fuel cell she had, in a moment that struck her now as either excellent foresight or extraordinary paranoia, thought to take from the palace stores along with the fragment. She made camp in a crevice of rock, rigged the canvas, ate half a ration bar, and listened to the wind. The pursuit had dropped back during the storm. She could no longer hear them. This might mean they had lost her trail, or it might mean they were experienced enough to know that pushing through a mountain storm was how you lost people permanently. Not through escape, but through exposure. And they were waiting it out below the worst of it, in the tree line, letting the mountain do their work for them. She thought about this, and about the shape of the problem she was carrying. The Vethkai fragment was warm in her hands. She unwrapped it and looked at it in the dim light, as she had done many times over the past years of study, though always before in the safety of a research archive rather than a mountain crevice in a storm. It was beautiful, in the way that things were sometimes beautiful when you understood enough about them to see past the surface. The facets caught whatever light there was and broke it into colors that didn't quite have names, colors that existed in the space between the ones the eye was designed to perceive. She had read everything written about the Vethkai. She had read the human engineer's original research notes, copied in painstaking longhand from records that the Conclave kept in a restricted archive she had accessed by the simple expedient of bribing a clerk with a sum of money that had taken her 2 years to quietly accumulate. She had read the early Dominion intelligence assessments, which had made their way west through a chain of intermediaries so tangled that tracing it made her head hurt. She had read the theoretical work of a Conclave mathematician who had worked out, 20 years ago, exactly what the assembled array could do, and then apparently decided that the most responsible thing to do with this knowledge was to encrypt it in a notation system of her own invention and die without telling anyone the key. Kael'vor had spent 14 months decrypting it. What she had found at the bottom of all that research was this: the Vethkai was not primarily a weapon. It had been shaped into a weapon calibrated for destruction by processes that required considerable expertise and time, but its fundamental nature was something else. The original engineers had called it a resonance array. It didn't destroy. It listened. It amplified. Pointed at a structure, and it would find that structure's frequency and match it perfectly, and then exceed it, and the structure would come apart at its own seams, unable to sustain itself against the pressure of its own resonance. You could use this to destroy a city wall from 40 leagues. You could also use it for other things. She thought about this as the storm drove snow sideways past the mouth of her crevice, and the fragment pulsed warmly in her hands. There were always other things. Rameth did not look like a warlord's operative. He looked like what he was, publicly, a designer of ornamental armor, a man of taste and cultivated manner, someone who knew which wines to serve with which courses, and who could discourse for an hour on the aesthetic properties of various metalworking techniques. He was tall, well-formed, dressed with the kind of understated care that suggested money worn lightly, and he had the easy, slightly distant charm of a man who had never needed to be anxious about whether people would find him interesting. Stayer disliked him immediately, which was a professional reflex and not particularly useful. Dutch found him, navigating the back roads above the city with the certainty of someone who had traveled them many times, in a hunting lodge 2 days north of Var Ashek, a comfortable stone building with good sight lines in all directions, and 3 guards positioned where guards positioned by someone competent would be positioned. Dutch walked past the first guard while Stayer went around. The guard Dutch walked past had approximately 4 seconds to realize that Dutch walking toward him with a hand extended in greeting was not the social encounter it appeared to be, and then he was on the ground, and the sound he made going down was covered by the wind. Inside, Rameth was in the process of preparing to move. Crates were being loaded. The carrying case sat on a table, open, its 4 fragments nested in custom foam. A map was spread nearby, weighted at corners by cups that still held traces of something warm. Stayer came through the back window in the moment between the second guard going down outside and the third guard starting to understand that something was wrong. The Spaniard came out of a side room fast and accurate, and there was a stretch of about 40 seconds that Stayer would later have difficulty reconstructing in sequence, during which several things happened simultaneously, and the question of how it ended was genuinely uncertain. It ended with Rameth against the wall, and the Spaniard on the floor and Stayer bleeding from a cut along his left arm that was unpleasant but not serious, and Dutch standing in the doorway looking at the carrying case. 4 pieces, Dutch said. There are 5, Stayer said. I know, Dutch's voice was still flat, still careful, but something in it had changed, not warmed exactly, but clarified, the way a sound clarifies when you stop hearing it through a wall. She's still up there. Rameth was watching them from the wall with the calculating eyes of a man trying to identify which angle of his situation was salvageable. Stayer had seen that expression before. It usually preceded an attempt at negotiation. "The girl won't make it to the station," Rameth said. "The Dominion has 3 people above the tree line, experienced mountain operatives. She's a researcher, a scholar, she's going to make it," Dutch said, flatly, without apparent uncertainty. Stayer looked at him. "I know the look," Dutch said. "I've seen it before. Someone who's decided what they're going to do and isn't going to stop deciding it until the thing is done or they're dead." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to have that look. I had it when I was young before I let people talk me out of it." He moved his jaw slightly, a small, private motion. "She'll make it." Stayer thought about the princess he had never met, climbing a mountain in a storm with a fragment of a world-ending weapon in her hands, and 3 professional operatives somewhere above her. "Then we need to be there," he said. The 3rd day of climbing. The storm had broken in the night, leaving behind a sky of extraordinary clarity, the kind of cold, precise, breathless sky that felt like the world had been rinsed clean and set out to dry. The snow on the upper slopes was unmarked. The Vard Pass lay another 6 hours above her, and the station another 2 hours beyond that. Kael'Vora had slept 4 hours, eaten the other half of the ration bar, and started moving before the sky was fully light. She found the first of them at mid-morning. He was on the path above her, not, she thought, by coincidence, which meant he had gotten above her during the storm, which meant he had pushed through the worst of it. A professional, then, as she had suspected. He was crouched beside a rock formation, watching her approach with the patience of someone who had been waiting long enough to be comfortable about it. When she was close enough, he stood up. He was an orc, which surprised her slightly. She had assumed Dominion operatives would be human, for reasons she couldn't fully justify. He was compact, heavily built, with the kind of flat, contained expression that came from training rather than nature. He had a short blade visible at his hip, and almost certainly another one somewhere she couldn't see. "The fragment," he said. His voice was careful with the trade language, accented but precise. "You will give it to me and walk back down the mountain. You will not be harmed." Kael'Vora looked at him. Then she looked past him, up the slope, doing the calculation. The path ran between 2 walls of rock above his position, a narrow section that required single-file movement. If the other 2 were above that section, they were effectively cut off from this interaction unless they came back down. She looked at the blade at his hip. She looked at the rock formation beside him. She looked at the slope above. She said no. He moved. She had anticipated this, not because she was trained in combat, she was not, but because she had spent enough time in archives reading about things that were real to know that when someone with a knife says, "Give me what you have and you won't be harmed," and you say no, the next thing that happens is predictable. She had spent the night thinking about what predictable was and what she might do about it. She dropped to her right and let him go past her and used the momentum of his lunge to guide him, not stop him. Guiding was possible. Stopping was not into the rock formation. He hit it with his shoulder and spun and came back fast, and she was already moving up the slope, running, the fragment pressed against her chest, her boots finding purchase in the snow with the focused desperation of someone who had decided that survival was a technical problem and was currently solving it. He was faster than her. She had known this would be true. The narrow section of path saved her. She reached it first by 3 seconds, which was not much but was enough. The rock walls pressed close on both sides. She could hear him behind her, close, too close, and she could hear something else, voices ahead, the other 2 coming back down through the narrows, understanding what was happening. She was going to be stopped in the middle, between them. She did the only thing she could think to do. She unwrapped the fragment. It blazed in the mountain light, facets catching the sun and throwing colors across the rock walls, colors without names, colors that lived between the colors that eyes were built for. She held it at arm's length, and she thought about everything she had read, about resonance and frequency, and the fundamental nature of a thing that was not a weapon unless someone shaped it to be one. She was no calibration engineer. She had no instruments. She had 14 months of decoded mathematics and 4 years of study, and the cold, clear knowledge that she was about to either prove a theory or die in the proving. She pressed the fragment against the rock wall, and she sang. It was a working song. Her grandmother had taught it to her, a song for long, repetitive labor, grinding grain, drawing water, the rhythmic domestic tasks that needed a rhythm to sustain them. A human musicologist had once told her that working songs were among the most mathematically precise vocal forms because they had to fit the cadence of the work exactly, had to lock into the rhythm of physical motion with enough precision to carry the worker through. They were tuned. They were calibrated. They were, in their way, frequencies. The fragment listened. The rock listened. She felt it before she heard it, a subsonic vibration in her sternum, in her back teeth, in the small bones of her inner ear. The rock under her hands was finding its frequency, recognizing the input, beginning to respond. Behind her, the first operative stopped moving, not because he had decided to, because the ground under his feet was doing something he had not expected. The crack ran up the wall to her left with a sound like a word in a language too large for her to understand, and the section of overhang above the narrows came down in a controlled cascade, not enough to kill anyone, enough to fill the path, enough to stop pursuit for the 4 hours she needed. She pulled the fragment back from the wall and ran. She heard the second operative, not saw, not anticipated, when she was 200 meters from the station. He came from behind a boulder she had assessed as empty, and he was close, too close, and she had no wall to press the fragment against and no time to sing. He grabbed her arm. She turned toward him instead of away, which surprised him enough to give her half a second, and she put the fragment directly in front of his face, blazing with the cold mountain light, throwing those nameless colors into his eyes. He flinched, involuntary, instinctive. Half a second became a second. She brought her elbow up hard into the underside of his chin, felt the impact shock up her arm to her shoulder, and he sat down on the snow with the slightly surprised expression of someone who had underestimated a scholar. She ran the last 200 meters. The Cathara station was smaller than she had imagined from the records. It was a low stone building, half buried in the slope for insulation, its instruments long since corroded and its internal systems dark. But the resonance chamber was a geological feature, not an engineered one, and geology did not corrode. She found it at the back of the building, a natural hollow in the rock that the original engineers had shaped and smoothed and fitted with brackets that had since lost whatever instruments they'd once held. The chamber hummed, very faintly, with the frequency of the mountain itself, a frequency so deep and constant that it was effectively silence unless you knew what you were listening for. She knew what she was listening for. She placed the fragment in the center of the hollow. It caught the chamber's frequency immediately, the way a tuning fork catches the note of the instrument it matches. The colors that blazed from it shifted, deepened, became something she could feel in her chest rather than see with her eyes. She stepped back and watched it and understood that she was watching a component become something other than a component. The array without this piece was not an array, was not a weapon, was nothing but 4 expensive and very strange crystals in a very expensive case. She sat down on the cold floor of the station and put her back against the wall and breathed. After a while she heard footsteps outside. She tensed. The door opened and a human came in, followed by Dutch. She had not expected Dutch. She stared at him, and he stared back at her, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with the cost of it. "You made it," he said. "Obviously," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The human stare, he introduced himself. Conclave intelligence. Looked at the fragment in the resonance chamber, and then looked at her, and the look on his face was not the look of a man who had expected to find this. "You understood what it was," he said, not a question. "I spent 4 years understanding what it was," she said. "Someone had to." They came down from the mountain on the 4th day. Kael'vora, Stair, Dutch, and the 3rd Dominion operative who had been waiting near the station and had, upon finding himself facing Dutch and a conclave agent rather than a lone scholar, made the reasonable assessment that his contract terms did not require him to die for this particular outcome. The carrying case with the 4 fragments came down too, secured by Stair in the lodge before they had moved upward. Below the tree line, the 2 surviving Dominion operatives from the Narrows were sitting on a rock looking cold and constrained, watched by a pair of conclave agents who had arrived in the night. Rameth, apparently, had tried to run and had not succeeded. Kael'vora walked through all of this without stopping. She was very tired. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn to her own wedding, which now had 3 days of mountain climbing in them, and she was carrying the fragment wrapped in its leather binding, because she had decided in the station that it needed to stay with her until she could personally ensure that it was secured somewhere that required more than one bribe to access. Stair fell into step beside her. "What happens now?" he said. She had been thinking about this. "The conclave needs to understand what the Vethkai actually is," she said, "not just what it can be made into. The weapon application is one possibility out of many. Some of the others are considerably more interesting." "Such as?" "I've been working on that," she said. "The resonance properties, if you approach them as amplification rather than destruction, the applications are extensive. Communication, structural analysis, medical imaging potentially, though that requires more theoretical work." She looked at him sideways. "It's possible to spend 4 years learning about a dangerous thing and come away understanding not that it should be destroyed, but that it should be understood differently." Stair was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you took it, not just to stop the weapon?" She considered how to answer this honestly. "I took it because someone was coming for it in the night, and I was the only one awake, and I knew what it was," she said. "The rest I figured out as I went." Dutch had moved ahead of them, walking down through the trees with the particular economy of movement of a man who had decided where he was going and didn't need to think about it anymore. She watched him for a moment. "He told me I'd make it," she said. "He did. Did he believe it?" "I think he needed to," Stair said. Then, after a moment, which might be the same thing. They reached the lowland road at dusk. In that long flat light that turns everything briefly amber and precise, the way things look when the day has finally decided what it is. Var Ashek was 2 days south. The clan mothers were presumably in the middle of a significant political crisis regarding the disappearance of a bride. Drath of the Western Garrison was presumably also somewhere in this picture, though what his disposition might be toward a bride who had walked off a wedding and stolen, a strategic military asset, was difficult to predict. Kael'vora found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not particularly anxious about any of this. She was tired. She was dirty. Her feet hurt in the way that feet hurt when they have been asked to carry someone over rocks and through snow for 3 days without adequate preparation. She had a bruise on her right elbow where she had hit the second operative, and a cut on her left hand she hadn't noticed until it had already stopped bleeding, and she was hungry in the deep, patient way that follows sustained fear, when the body has finally been told it can need things again. But she was not anxious. She was, in some way she couldn't quite articulate, something closer to her own shape than she had been in a very long time. She had been useful. She had done the thing that needed doing. She had spent 4 years becoming the only person positioned to understand the problem, and then positioned herself, by chance or calculation or some combination that she suspected would be impossible to fully untangle, to solve it. She sat on a stone at the edge of the road, and unwrapped the fragment one more time, and looked at it in the amber light. It was warm. It was, she thought, possibly the most important object in the world, in the specific sense that its misuse could end a world and its correct use might do something else, something she had not yet fully defined. She had the mathematics. She had the theoretical framework. She had now the political situation of a princess who had embarrassed the Dominion on a mountain and might, depending on how it was played, have leverage she hadn't had a week ago. Stayer sat down on a rock nearby, at the respectful distance of a man who understood when someone needed to think. "The conclave is going to want a full briefing," he said. "Yes. The Dominion is going to deny everything and call this an internal clan matter." "Yes. And your mother is going to be." "My mother," Kael'vora said, "is going to be angry in the specific way of someone who is also relieved but isn't ready to admit it. She'll be angry for approximately 3 days, and then she'll start asking questions, and the questions will be the important part." She wrapped the fragment back up. "She's very good at questions." Dutch came back down the road to where they were sitting. He stood for a moment, looking out at the lowland spread below them, the distant lights of the first farms beginning to glow against the darkening. "The Dominion will try again," he said. "The Dominion always tries again," Kael'vora said. "It's patient. That's what makes it dangerous." "So what do we do about patient?" She thought about the resonance chamber, about the working song, about the crack running up the rock face and the controlled cascade, and the 4 hours of time she had bought herself with a frequency and 14 months of mathematics. "We understand the instrument better than they do," she said, "and then we change what it does." Dutch looked at her for a long moment. His face was the face of a man who had been waiting for a long time to hear something that made sense of the long road behind him, and who was now, cautiously, in the way of someone who had been disappointed enough times to be careful about hope, beginning to suspect he had found it. "All right," he said. The amber light faded. The stars were already out above the mountains, cold and precise and indifferent, and the mountains themselves rose against them in a wall of black basalt and ancient ice, vast and permanent and entirely unconcerned, with the small figures picking their way down from them. The mountains did not care that she was a queen. But she had come back down from them, and she had come back changed, and the world she descended into was, in ways not yet visible, already different from the world she had left. She walked south. She did not look back. 6 months later, in a room she had requisitioned from the Conclave archive, and converted into a working laboratory, Kael'vora completed the first full theoretical framework for resonance-based communication across the Vethkai array. It was not a weapon. Stayer read the summary twice and set it down on the table. "How far?" he said. "In theory, hemisphere-wide. Clean transmission, no interference, no interception. The resonance is non-directional. It's not a signal traveling from point to point. It's a frequency shift in the medium. You can't block a medium. The Dominion will want it. The Dominion is going to find," she said, carefully, with the calm of a person who had thought about this at length, "that several things they expected to want, they have difficulty acquiring." She had spent the 6 months well. The political situation with Drath had resolved itself in a direction that she had found, on reflection, rather satisfying. The Dominion had quietly declined to press its marriage claim after the details of the mountain incident became clear to enough of the right people, and Warlord Drath had been reassigned to a posting in the Deep East that suggested someone in the Dominion hierarchy had concluded he was more of a liability than an asset. Her mother had been angry for 3 days exactly, and then had started asking questions, and the questions had been very good. Dutch was in the city. He had taken a position that was not officially anything, and involved mostly providing security for the archive building, and he carried out this role with the focused, quiet competence of a man who had decided what he was good at, and was content to be good at it without requiring recognition for the being. Stayer was still formally conclave intelligence, though his actual activities had, over the months, increasingly involved a room down the hall from Kael'Vor's laboratory, and a steady supply of the reports she passed him on the Dominion's movements. He had a gift for seeing patterns in information, and a gift for asking the question that she hadn't yet thought to ask, and she had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that these gifts were useful in ways that went beyond the professional. She picked up the fragment from where it sat on her workbench, warm as always, throwing nameless colors in the lamplight. She had not neutralized it in the resonance chamber. She had stabilized it, which was a different thing. It was still what it was. It was still capable of what it was capable of. The difference was that it was in the hands of someone who understood it fully enough to know that the most powerful thing you could do with a resonance array was not to destroy what you pointed it at, but to change the frequency of the space it inhabited. She had been changing the frequency for 6 months. She would keep changing it. Outside, the city of Var Ashek was doing what cities do in the evening, settling in, lighting fires, making and eating food, conducting the 10,000 small transactions of ordinary life that constituted, taken together, the reason you'd want to defend a world rather than let someone reduce it to its resonant frequency and watch it come apart. She put the fragment down, picked up her pen, and went back to work. There was always more to understand. And understanding, she had found, was the only thing that could not be stolen.